What's the creepiest family secret you've been told? Viewer's Edition. Story 1. It started for my mom when my grandmother stayed home with my sick infant mom instead of picking up her 6-year-old son off the school bus. He was hit by 2 cars getting off. One threw him in front of the other, and the other ran him over. He passed away. He was my grandfather's only son. My grandfather was a mess because his mom was a known floozy, and he was born like a year after his dad passed away. We think the father was a traveling Irish auctioneer. When my mother was 14, my grandfather got mad at my grandmother and took her car and drove it at 100 miles per hour into a wall. That night, a neighbor's kid came to take my mother on a drive to comfort her, and he assaulted her. Not long after, my mom tried to off herself and was commuted, where she met a 27-year-old schizophrenic man with mommy issues and married him at 16. Around the time she wanted to leave him with my big sister, she was assaulted again and got pregnant and had to get an abortion. At this point, my mom was hooked on speed diet pills, which became a meth habit, and her husband blackmailed her by hiring a detective to make her come back to him. When she couldn't take it anymore, she slit her wrists, then threatened to end the life of her husband, screaming, "Look, I'm crazy. I will end your life." She went to her mom's house with my sister and quit drugs cold turkey. She married my dad, who came after us with a shotgun when she tried to leave him. After she married my stepdad, my dad tried to kidnap me. While married to my stepdad, she lost interest in intimacy and let my dad get a side chick because he wanted to stay with my mom because he loved her but wanted to be intimate. This side chick was my mom's gay awakening, and like my mom was my stepdad's great love, this woman was my mom's great love. When I was little, they kinda had a throuple thing going on. Then the side chick had a psychotic break and my mom lost her. Things got a lot calmer after that, but my mom still struggled and dealt with bouts of severe depression. Although I'll add, when she was 21, her baby sister told her their stepdad was touching her, and my mom had to tell my grandmother. He stayed, paying my grandmother's bills and taking care of her, but lived in a rented apartment. After my aunt left home, he came back. He always gave me the creeps, and after hearing this story, I was a bit flabbergasted that my sister and I were sent to stay with them during the summer. My story is pretty crazy too, generational trauma and all that, but as I have a kid now, I've made sure that my kid doesn't have those kinds of experiences. She's doing great. Story 2. Everyone knows it in my family, but none of us talk about it with each other. My grandma's second husband is the man she had an affair with while she was still married to my grandpa. They met in their church choir and had a secret affair for 5 years before we all found out. They got married 4 years after her divorce with my grandpa. I was the flower girl at their wedding, and they've been together for more than 15 years now. Her second husband is a really weird man, talks about the Bible in every conversation, and knows how to make an entire room of people feel uncomfortable. In the last 5 years, he's become more and more controlling of her, keeping her from seeing us, answering her phone when we try to call her, and they refuse to get vaccinated, and they've gotten the virus more than once. There's also a rumor circulating in my family that he's a certain type of creep, and he might have tried to hurt my cousin when she was under 5 years old. My grandfather told us on his deathbed that he had a 4th brother that he'd never told us about that was part of the SS and died on the Eastern Front during World War II. He also told us what happened when his family, mother, grandmother, and 2 aunties, along with the kids, were found hiding in a barn by partisans, but that's not something I'll inflict on others. Oh, Grandpa definitely was a rolling stone. I have 13 aunts and uncles. 5 are his with Grandma. They divorced when I was like a fetus. They got along a lot better after that. Bless their hearts. Story 3. Honestly, a lot of the dark things in my family don't really shock me. Alcoholism? Yep. Not being emotionally available to their kids? Yep. Racism? Yep, especially my cousins. My grandmother says stuff along those lines sometimes, but then also says stuff about how black people are mistreated, and she has photos from protests in the 70s, so yeah, not sure if that was influenced by my grandfather or something else. Doesn't make it okay, just not sure why the back and forth. The thing that shocked me the most was the history of mental illness. I knew I was mentally ill, alongside my siblings. I'm on the spectrum, ADHD, clinical anxiety, and clinical depression. Siblings are in similar boats. But the more I've examined my family, the more I've realized it didn't just come from childhood trauma. Apparently, a lot of my family has clinical anxiety, PTSD, ADHD, even some bipolar disorder for a few of them, but it was kind of ignored. Instead, the problems discussed being racism, drug use, and alcoholism. Like, I used to think they were all white recycling, not bad enough to be trash, but really close. They weren't violent, but their opinions were questionable, as well as their lifestyles. But the more I've studied my family and their patterns, the more saddened I've become. A lot of them are really broken people, and instead of coping healthily, they were raised to get into substances and bad habits. My siblings and I were spared because my dad didn't like his family, and we were raised about the good and the bad. I'm happy my parents raised us right, but it still saddens me that a lot of my extended family aren't helping themselves and weren't raised to do so. Well, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. A good parent has to take care of themselves first, figure out their own issues, and develop a healthy mental state, and the impact of that will naturally trickle down to the kids. Live by example, and you can break the chain of bad habits through the generations. Probably easier said than done, but the outcome and the betterment of your family is definitely worth the effort. Story 4. Got a few, although the majority seem to be on the fringes of the extended family. Stuff like, apparently my grandfather on my dad's side would physically attack my grandmother. I knew he had a dark streak, but his constitution was weak, so I thought it was only limited to verbal abuse. Didn't know until after both had passed away back in 2019. Another was out of the blue when my mother told me that someone in her extended family had AR'd a very young member of the family. In the process, this child got herpes from it and eventually was rendered sterile. She would not say who it was, other than they were female. Never spoke about it again. I know it wasn't our immediate family because all her brothers and sisters had kids. The only one who didn't had a miscarriage. And the final story is about my father's grandfather, my great-grandfather. All we know is that he was a college professor for a living, and yet everyone in town seemed to owe him a favor. I didn't know just how far those favors would go until my grandfather casually mentioned to his father over the phone sometime in 1946 that he was getting tired of being in the military. Within 2 weeks, he was discharged and heading home. He later found out that his father, my great-grandfather, had called up a state representative to cash in a favor. This representative contacted a general, and they started the discharge process. I don't know what kind of discharge, other than it wasn't a dishonorable discharge. It's stuff like that which makes me wonder if he ever had mob ties, because that's the kind of stuff they do. Story 5. Lots of stories about grandmas, so I figured I would talk about my grandma a bit. My grandma and grandpa divorced when my dad was about 18. My grandpa moved out where I currently live, and my grandma lives in the next state over with most of her family. My grandpa passed away in August of 2018, and my grandma passed a few months ago. We had her funeral about a month ago. It was pretty small. Usually at funerals you tell stories about the person, right? Well, not this one. She was a big mystery. I've only ever heard one story, and even my dad and uncles and her siblings had only heard a few stories. Every time I ask my dad about her life, there are a bunch of time gaps that he doesn't know anything about. She was a big mystery, and every time I heard anything from her, I felt that there was just this great air of mystery about it, and she was just struggling to hide so much. It's pretty weird now that I think about it. Whenever people say, spend time with family while they're still there, they won't always be. I usually just roll my eyes and ignore them, but now that my grandma is gone, I regret not spending more time with her. I didn't see her often, and when I had the chance to see her, I would usually just keep to myself. I haven't had many interactions with her beyond the point of turning 5, but I still think about the few interactions we did have. This one is a great reminder to hang out with your grandparents, if you're lucky enough to still have them. I know this OP's grandma wasn't an open book, but if your folks are willing to talk about their lives over the years, you can definitely learn some really interesting first-hand accounts of historical events. Maybe not every elderly person has accounts from well-known historical events, but they surely have lived a full life of their own, and there's certainly some golden nuggets of life experience that they can impart on those willing to listen. Story 6. I had an uncle everyone called Lefty because he had only one arm. But it was his right arm, so it was like calling a huge dude tiny, or some bald dude curly. Anyway, I never could find out why he had only one arm. I knew he wasn't born that way. I'd seen pics of him as a child, and one of him in his army uniform, and he had both arms. I asked my mom, and she said something about cleaning a gun that went off, but I could tell she wasn't being honest with me, which was very unlike my mom. It wasn't until he passed away that I heard the family talking about the incident where he was left by the woman he left his first wife for. First wife? That was news to me. He tried to off himself with a gun, but botched it and ended up losing his arm from the elbow down. My aunt felt guilty and they got back together. All that was very confusing to me because they were uber religious. My aunt acted like sugar wouldn't melt in her mouth. Turns out she was an adulterer and a divorcee. Both no-nos in our church. Talk about hypocrisy. I have since learned my father's family was a regular soap opera, and I found out only after he passed. Entertaining to say the least. Story 7. Not necessarily creepy, but here goes. I have 2. Number 1. I was never supposed to know my dad. My mom hated him because, and these were her words, he was a liar. I guess he lied about something she felt was pretty serious. I never found out what that was. I have an older half-sister, and my mom was going to tell everyone that I was my older sister's father's kid. My grandma made my mom tell my dad he was going to have a kid 2 weeks before I was born. As far as I know, I was his first child, so that was a pretty big deal to him. Number 2, my dad basically coerced my mom into marriage. She was pregnant with my younger sister, and he kept asking her to marry him. He was raised Catholic, so I'm assuming that played a huge part, seeing as he already had a mustard child, me, and she kept saying no, until he left an engagement ring on the stove, and I guess my mom had enough and finally agreed. They did have happy moments, and he loved her until the day he passed away. My mom, however, slowly stopped loving him, and I think he knew that. But he was still there for her, and she was still there for him. I think a lot of people nowadays are seeing how many of the rules of traditional religion aren't actually beneficial to the modern way of life. And I think this story is a good example. If the basis for their marriage was solely to appease the church because you can't have a child out of wedlock, then their holy matrimony was already setting off on the wrong foot. Sure, it's great that they supported one another throughout their lives, but if that's not coming from a place of love and instead from religious obligation, then I think it shows in ways you can't always control, and the kids will pick up on these subtleties. I'm glad it's more common nowadays to reevaluate ourselves and our home lives, and, of course, correct course when you need to, and be the best that we can to find the most beneficial path for the overall health of all the family members. And yeah, sometimes that means divorce is the best option in the long run. Story 8. One of my uncles had an affair with a second cousin. My family is huge. We have a family jungle. So I have a cousin who's both my first and third cousin. He's super sweet and looks more like my uncle than his 3 kids with his wife. None of them want anything to do with him. The kids are well into their 60s now, and my uncle and his wife are still alive and in their 90s. My third cousin is my age, and I'm in my 30s. Apparently, because I'm close with everyone, his grandkids don't know about this other uncle of theirs, and that their grandpa got busy with family. My mom and aunts have told me everyone suspected something was up, and when the cousin got pregnant, they were like, "Oh my God, no way." I'm not sure why I know this, but I'm not surprised. I honestly would be surprised if he didn't have more love childs out there. Story 9. My dad's family was a mess of family secrets. No red rum as far as I know, but plenty of lies. My grandmother's oldest son was an affair baby. It was common knowledge to them because Grandpa was in the army at the time and couldn't have been the father. But it was hushed up by the time I was born. Didn't learn that until my grandmother passed away. Also, I grew up being told that my father's brother had passed away as a teenager at a local lake trying to save the lives of some drowning kids. Turns out the actual story was that he got stupid drunk, fell off the boat, got caught in the reeds, and drowned. So, yeah, my heroic uncle wasn't actually that heroic. Story 10. About the story with the wigs, if it is at a large pharmacy, especially a chain, you can see thousands of people every month, easily 4,000 to 5,000. We'd probably notice if someone repeatedly came in with different wigs, as that's bizarre to be honest, but someone just normally coming in to pick up for many different people of different names isn't that strange. At least in Los Angeles, there are many healthcare people who come in and do this for patients. Also, people who live in a house with many others, which is super common out here. Also, if I saw a woman doing the wig changes, it wouldn't be that odd to me, because I've known a few women who wore different wigs, now as an adult. Story 11. My great-grandfather was one of the first people to step foot in a concentration camp, and to take pictures. I've seen them, and they are horrific. I've always believed my family was the perfect, happy family. Now that my grandpa moved in, I see otherwise. My sweet grandpa is extremely bipolar. Not his fault, may I point out, just a shock to me, and expects us to bend over backwards for him, and my fun uncle has some obvious undiagnosed mental illnesses, and tells my grandpa he'll visit him, but doesn't show up. I love them both to bits, but it's kinda distressing to discover these sides of them. Luckily, a lot of those mental issues seem to have missed my father. Story 12. That my aunt's husband made molesting phone calls to my other uncle's ex-wife's and children's house, where he was just moaning or breathing on the phone, and they backtracked it to their landline. I never found out if this is actually true, and nobody in the family ever talks about it. And my uncle is being treated by my brother, parents, and grandparents like it hasn't happened. My cousin, to whom the calls were made, told me and my brother this almost 15 years ago when I was 19 or 20 years old. Now I would not know how to bring it up and ask her when I see her, which is almost never. Story 13. I'm a victim of such a lineage. My mom was with an abusive man. He touched my sister, wasn't believed, then in her teenage years, left me alone with him as a toddler. Now, mind you, I don't blame her for the teenage thing, but she then proceeded multiple times to try and get this man to babysit her own kids. I had to be the one to watch over them, make sure they were never one-on-one with him, and every day after 4, they were not allowed to go see their grandpa again because I knew he did those things while drunk or on drugs. Please leave your stories in the comments. I'd love to make a video of them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.